Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Every Term Mental Health. Mental isn't a bad word. There's no health without mental health. We're here to talk about every high and low. No limits, just good conversations.
Hello, everyone. I am joined today by Julia Smith, who is a business psychologist, and Julia runs an organisation called People Science Consulting that works with organisations on talent leadership and talent development. And I'm really pleased that Julia's joined us today to talk about a really important topic in the business world and in life in general. And that is all about imposter syndrome and those people-pleasing behaviours that people often display in life, in work, and all the bits and the impact around what that can have on their lives. So, welcome, Julia.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you.
So, imposter syndrome and people-pleasing behaviours. Should we pick those off as two separate topics, or shall we start with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, because
What is it?
they are interlinked, but they are quite distinct as well. So, imposter syndrome is well, I'm going to start actually by not calling it imposter syndrome.
Right.
So that's what it's commonly known as. So that feeling that we are somehow a bit of a fraud, we're not good enough to do a particular job, and somehow when we feel like an imposter, it's almost like that feeling that our any success is attributed to luck, or it's not down to our skill and capability. So it's this sense of sort of not feeling good enough and feeling a bit of a fraud. The reason that I would say we would challenge the word syndrome, which is what it's commonly known as, and everybody talks about syndrome, is syndrome suggests that it's something that is wrong with you and has a sort of long-term effect. So now more and more researchers are talking not about imposter syndrome, but imposter phenomenon. And we also, I mean, some people are even saying phenomenon's too strong a word as well. So, we have psychologists out there that refer to it as imposter thinking, imposter moments. And the reason being is that a recent study showed that up to about 70% of people at some point will experience imposterism. And so it's actually quite a normal thing. And so it's not a syndrome as such. So I always think that that's a really important point to make, that it's not we don't suffer from it necessarily. Some people do. It's like there's a spectrum, right? There'll be somebody who experience it, people who experience it really acutely. But actually, most people experience imposter moments or moments of imposterism. So it's that feeling. So what is imposterism? So it's that feeling of not feeling quite good enough, not quite up to the job. Somebody's going to find us out sooner or later. And it's a lot of sort of negative self-talk. And people often attribute it to personality traits, and which might has an influence. But often it's just circumstances and context that creates it for us. And it's then about recognizing that and then doing something about it.
So I'm a big. I think that I wrote down there that imposter thinking. I took that away as my new favourite way of describing it there, because you're right. It is imposter thinking. It's situational, isn't it? And so how does that manifest in a person? How would they feel if they were having a moment of imposter thinking or imposterism?
It's interference. It's interference in our productivity, our performance, and our well-being as well. And if you were to ask 10 people when you experience imposterism, say, people would normally share things like, oh, a sick feeling, or a feeling of anxiety or trepidation, or feeling scared about approaching a particular situation, or feeling anxious about failing or letting people down, or so there's lots and lots of negative emotions which cause this interference, is the way what I always describe it. It kind of gets in the way of you doing what you need to do and being productive and learning and growing and all that good stuff. So it's negative emotions that interfere with us.
And psychologically speaking, then, so what's causing that to someone? Because I think about my own career, and I share this story quite regularly with people that um, I was quite young when I started out in leadership roles. Probably I was always the youngest person in the room. I'm not anymore, which is really upsetting. But normally it was the youngest person in the room, and I always thought the adults were in the other room. So I
Yeah,
always thought, I always thought once
yeah,
I get to that room, once you become a director, once you become this, you'll go to the room where the adults are, where the grown-up conversations are. Well, you get in that room and you realize that's not the room. There isn't
mm,
actually a room where the adults are, and that's my way of thinking. That's how I always used to think: is I'm the youngest person in this room. I don't have the worth of being there because all of these much older people who are much more experienced, they weren't.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then I started to think, but then you realize there isn't another room.
No, 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 absolutely. And I think one of the reassuring things that I've learned is that because it is so normal, like 70% of us experience it at
Mm.
some point. That means even if there was another room full of, more experienced people, they would 70% of that room would be experiencing it as well. And there's something really reassuring
Yes.
about that. So even the people who might come across as the most together and confident and they know their stuff and all that kind of stuff, there's a really good chance that they have at some point experienced imposterism and imposter thinking for sure.
I mean, if in a room of 10 people, if seven of them are feeling the same way you are,
Yeah.
then, there's a comfort in there. But I suppose we'll come on to talk about coping techniques and how to manage that.
Yeah.
But actually being open and honest and talking about it feels like it's probably one of the most easiest coping strategies because if 70% of people are in the
Yeah.
same boat,
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And I think, as you say, we'll come on to coping strategies, but actually if we create a climate and a culture where of psychological safety, which we've talked about a lot in the past, that
yeah,
sort of the sense of psychological safety that I can take some interpersonal risks and I can share how I'm feeling and I know I won't be judged or labeled, then you can have those kind of conversations to say, do you know what, I'm just not feeling good about this, or I'm not feeling confident about this. And actually I could do with some help and maybe some reassurance that this is all right.
yeah.
So absolutely having those kind of conversations, knowing that a good proportion of people experience the similar sort of self-doubt.
So we've got our situation where we have imposter thinking, and we're thinking that we don't belong or we're sick. We feel nervous because we're going to be found out because we don't we haven't earned our position where we are or we're not good enough. All those things. What does that manifest then potentially into people pleasing behaviours?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, imposter syndrome kind of manifests itself in perfectionism,
Hmm.
or people who have a propensity for perfectionism tend to experience imposterism more. So that wanting to be, the super person that gets it right for everybody and themselves, um, overworking, over preparing, um, saying yes to everything to be able to prove themselves. That is probably where imposter and people pleasing interlinked. That's where
Yes.
they hinge together.
And some of the things you've just described there, classic traits to leading to burnout.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, 100%. And particularly with imposter thinking, if you procrastinate, or if you're striving for perfection, or you've got this sort of sense of anxiety and fear of failure, then you're never going to be productive. A lot of people with imposter thinking, or imposterism, they they tend to work really hard at being busy rather than productive because they
Yes.
feel that that's what demonstrates their worth.
And they're not measuring impact, they're not measuring outcomes.
Yeah,
People in that mindset think that time equals outcome.
yeah, 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 absolutely, yeah. And that's just one suboptimal outcome of imposter syndrome. There's all sorts of things that if we don't check it And if we don't, see, I said imposter syndrome, imposter thinking. There
Do
you
I get to
go.
pull you up each time you do it? I should have a
You
little
do
buzzer, shouldn't I? Press the
absolutely,
buzzer each
yeah.
time you get it.
Oh, syndrome bingo. Let's play that. But yeah, there's all sorts of negative outcomes to imposter thinking, which is productivity, which is performance, which is burnout, and actually quite simply just missed opportunities as well. I always remember when I experienced it. I was working for GE at the time, and we bought a business that was down the road from where we were. There were noises about me going on to be the HR director in that particular business, and I thought, no, I'm not good enough for it. It's too big a job. It's global. Even though people were making noises that I would be going into that job, and I never put my hand up, and I never said anything. I just sat tight until my HR manager rang me one day and said, "What are you doing?" Harry, our boss at the time, Harry wants you to do that job, but he thinks you don't want it because you've never mentioned the fact that you're interested in it. And that ended up being one of the most pivotal roles of my entire career. And I nearly didn't get it because I just sat there thinking, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, waiting for somebody to come and tell me I was good enough. And it was only when, the intervention from that person that meant that I actually went and did it. So even just missing out on opportunities is big, let alone all the well-being and burnout risks associated with it.
And I think there is nothing worse than missed opportunities there. There's nothing that leads to bigger regrets than
Yeah,
missed opportunity.
absolutely.
Because
Yeah, completely.
that it never leaves you that field, does it? About,
No,
if you always look back and go, why didn't I do that?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The regret for the things that we didn't do actually is
Yeah.
more potent than regret on the things that we have done.
So just going back to those people pleasing
Mm,
behaviors,
mhm,
when we
mhm.
asked people about topics for discussion,
Yeah,
this came up quite a lot.
yeah,
And we all see this in life, and we're all guilty of it in life sometimes,
yeah, yeah,
actually, because one of my colleagues constantly says to me that clear is kind and unclear is unkind. I think she stole it, didn't she? But she cites it to me every other day, and and there is something about that lack of clarity in that people pleasing behavior, isn't there? That people will just say yes to it, or they'll
yeah,
they'll procrastinate giving an answer because they don't want to upset someone. When
yeah.
actually being more direct and being more clear is
Mm,
actually better for all involved.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah,
And that,
yeah.
sorry, go on,
No,
going to
no,
cut
go on,
through.
go on.
So what do we see as the negative impacts of that people pleasing behavior, and why are people doing it?
Um, I think the reasons why people do it are pretty varied and personal. So for many people, it's just a real desire to be liked,
Hmm.
a really strong desire to be liked. For some people, it's a fear of rejection, it's to avoid a fear of rejection. For some people, it's about wanting to progress and to be seen, to be the team player and the person that will pick up the slack and do all the. So I think it's quite a personal thing. And I actually think if you feel that you are a people pleaser, the starting point is to understand that. So
Yeah.
what is it? What is driving that people pleasing behavior? And then you're better equipped to do something about it.
Well, that's a good segue into the let's do something about it. So I think it's really good that we've had a discussion there around what is the problem or what can the problems be. Let's talk about some solutions for people. So anyone who's listening or watching and thinking, actually, I recognize those people pleasing traits you've discussed. I recognize the piece around imposter thinking. What can people do?
Yeah. So in terms of imposter thinking, I think the first thing is accept that it's most people experience it. So it's not a flaw, it's not something that's wrong with you. It's we all experience it. I think the second thing is for me is about focusing on your strengths. So, that's about taking the time to really think about, well, what am I good at? And how, in this situation where I'm feeling like I'm an imposter, how can I leverage my strengths? And that's you have to just stop and think and, reflect on that. I think when I'm certainly coaching people, and a technique that I use for myself is what I would refer to as a bit of a circuit breaker, because whether we're people pleasing or we're feeling like an imposter, basically what we're telling ourselves negative things about ourselves. So
Yes.
we're talking self-limiting beliefs, and the more we tell ourselves something, the more it actually becomes reality. So there has to be a bit of a circuit breaker. So one of the techniques that I use is taking some time to think about, okay, I've just told myself that I'm not good enough to do this. What is the evidence that suggests that's the case? And what's the disconfirming evidence
Yeah.
against it? And what we're doing is we're taking those very emotionally rational thoughts from the more primitive part of our brains to our prefrontal cortex. So we're becoming much more logical and
Mm.
rational, and that kind of acts as a bit of a circuit breaker from all these, from this negative self-talk. So I always, when I'm coaching, I often coach people to do that as an exercise as well, because, and then you see actually there's very little evidence to suggest that you're um, not good enough, but there's actually quite a bit of evidence to disconfirm that. Um, and I think the other thing is just to, particularly with imposterism, is just almost to reframe what you're thinking as well. So when you do get that sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, again, I'll just share a personal example. I remember flying off to do an international assignment last minute to cover some bereavement leave, and on that flight feeling really sick, that how could I possibly know how to run a department in like 6 7 different countries in a different continent. And what that taught me was that that sick feeling in my stomach, now I reframe that's not fear or worry or anxiety anymore. That means I'm about to learn something.
Yeah.
So I reframe it and actually go in with a sense of curiosity versus going in with a sense of I've got to know, I've got to know what I'm talking about. So, and that's really helped me. I think also with the people pleasing behaviors, as well as understanding what your strengths are, just really taking some time to understand what your needs are. What is it that you need? Because when you know that you're people pleasing, when you're doing things, when you're doing a task or doing something and you feel resentful about it, that's a difference between people pleasing when it's unhelpful and people
Yeah.
pleasing because you're being a good teammate. So if you feel that, if you're feeling resentful, then why are you feeling resentful? And what is it that you actually need? Boundaries is another, setting boundaries is a really another important aspect for people pleasing as well. So making sure that you've create time for yourself and boundaries for yourself. And probably the last thing I would say on people pleasing is courage. So
Mhm.
often one of the big downsides of people pleasing is not speaking up when it's important to do so, and practicing courage. And I know we haven't got time to go into it in a lot of detail, but I would just reference a guy called Jim Ditter. He's got a book called Courage, and he's got some really practical exercises that can help you just start become a bit more courageous in some of the conversations that you have.
And that courage is the courage to say no, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
The courage to go, the courage to say no, and but do it in a respectful way, and do it in a
Yeah,
way that actually you're not breaking down relationships. In fact, you're probably strengthening relationships because there's a
yeah.
better respect there between parties and a more equal power dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the one other really practical tactical thing that you can do. So I was coaching somebody recently who's a real people pleaser, and people just come to her and say, can you do this, or can you help me with this, and she just absorbs all of it. And so what we've talked about her doing is actually using coaching. So when somebody comes to her and says, can you help me with this, instead of just accepting it, now what she does is, okay, so what have you tried already?
Yeah.
So she's putting the response. So it's just, so she's not being unhelpful
No,
and she's not saying no, but she is saying to that person, well, have you tried to help yourself already, rather before you come to me? So there's like really practical
that's
little
great. I
things
like
that you
that.
can do.
And really reframing the request,
Yeah, absolutely. And putting some responsibility back on the person.
because it's very difficult, for someone then to say, "Well, I haven't done anything. I've just come straight to you."
Yeah,
That
yeah, yeah,
that's quite
absolutely.
that's quite a difficult thing to say out loud, isn't it, to someone? I've done nothing about this problem. I just came straight to you because you tend to deal with it.
Because I knew you would take it off me.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
you've got to
absolutely. Yeah.
be you've got to be a particular type of person to be able to say that with a straight face.
And I'm sure there's some people out there that can, but yeah, and it is working for her, which I think is important.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Great piece of advice. So these two topics are really important, and as you mentioned earlier on, a golden thread throughout all of this, in the business sense, and also I imagine in a personal sense as well, is being in an environment with psychological safety.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
know it's, we talk about that, like I say, a lot because it's one of the most important things. If you don't feel psychologically safe in the environment you're in, you're never going to be able to say no properly. You're never going to be able to, in your mind, people displease, and you're never
Yes.
going to be able to put your hand up and say, I don't feel like I know the answer, or I feel like an imposter in this room.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
psychological safety, I mean, that's a different conversation for another day. But if people don't feel like they're in a psychologically safe environment, is it going to be really difficult for them to enact some of these things you've said?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Completely. A psychologically unsafe environment will drive greater imposter thinking. So it will just compound imposter thinking. Um, from a people pleasing perspective, absolutely. So, acquiescing, just
Mm,
complying, not speaking up when it's really important to do so. And we know the implications of that, the financial crash, all sorts
yeah,
of big world events have come about because of a lack of psychological safety, because good people don't speak up because they
yes.
don't feel psychologically safe to be able to do so.
And of course, we obviously work in the world of healthcare, and every single scandal in the world of healthcare is attached to somebody not speaking up or somebody speaking up and nobody listening.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and it's quite tragic to listen to these sorts of stories, isn't it, when that happens?
It
So
is.
from that less chirpy part of the conversation to my final question for you, which is, if anyone's listening to this and they recognize everything we've talked about in themselves, what's your message of hope to those individuals?
Well, we can change, we can adapt, we can learn. This all comes down to having a level of self-awareness. So understanding that we are feeling these feelings, we are displaying these behaviors, understanding why, what's driving them, and then just building some techniques and strategies to break those circuit. I always talk about circuit breaker. So
Mm.
if you break that cycle of negative self-talk, then it's just you just need to pause, reflect, think, and then start to build some small habits to change it. So the message of hope is, well, firstly, you're not alone if you
Yeah,
feel like an
that's big.
imposter, but also that you can do something about it. You don't just have to accept it as some fundamental personality flaw that you can't change. We can definitely change this. It just takes self-awareness and a practice and new habits.
I feel we could have talked on this topic for hours and hours and
Oh,
hours and
good.
hours,
Yeah.
and I'm just so thankful for the time. And you mentioned some resources there from the
Mm,
Courage book there, and we'll pop any more useful resource you can think of. We'll
yeah.
pop we'll
Yeah.
pop it into the text as well, because there's
Okay.
there's there's lots of resources and books out there, and
There
and,
is.
and podcasts and things people can listen to. So we'll direct people to some of those, because it's such an important topic for people. And kind of going back to that final point there, that the missed opportunity from this. So
Mhm.
if you are feeling imposter thinking or imposter phenomenon or every other word for it, think about what we can do positively, because we don't want anyone having regrets for missed opportunity.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Julia, it's been an absolute honor. Thank you so much
Oh,
for
lovely.
taking the
No,
time to
thank
speak to me
you.
today.
No,
And thanks for being brilliant.
oh, thank you very much. Well, likewise. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Every Turn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate, and share. See you next time.